The man scheduled for execution at 6 a.m. was, at that very moment, serving as my acolyte at the 6 a.m. Mass. I understand the immediate surge of disbelief that coils in your gut. The urge to dismiss this as a macabre joke, a fevered delusion from an old priest whose mind has perhaps begun to fray at the edges. But I swear on the chalice I held, its cool metal a familiar weight in my palm, on the host I consecrated, the very body of our Lord broken for us. It is the unvarnished, terrifying truth. Every fiber of my being, every memory burned into the very marrow of my bones, testifies to it. It was just past dawn, the deepest blue of the lingering night sky, softening to a bruised, hopeful purple at the horizon. The air in St. Jude's, even within the sacristy's close confines, held the crisp, almost biting chill of a late autumn morning, a persistent whisper of cold that seeped through the old stone walls. The stained glass windows, usually ablaze with glorious light, were barely beginning to catch the nascent sun, refracting its hesitant rays into muted, bruised blues and purples that stretched across the worn linoleum floor like spilled wine on an ancient tapestry. The silence in the sanctuary was not empty, but full, filled with the quiet hum of prayer, the faint scent of yesterday's incense still clinging to the vestments, and the promise of grace. The small congregation, just a handful of our most devout souls, huddled in the pews, their figures indistinct in the low light. These were the faithful, the early risers, familiar faces etched with the quiet dignity of those seeking solace in the stillness before the boisterous world intruded. There was Mrs. O'Malley, perpetually early, her rosary already clicking softly through her fingers. Young Thomas, clutching his tattered missal like a talisman, his eyes fixed on the altar with childish reverence, and old Mr. Henderson, whose deep, resonant cough was as much a fixture of daily mass as the crucifix itself. They were my anchor, my flock, their presence a comforting, predictable rhythm in my priestly life. I was just turning from the altar, my hands already moving with the familiar hallowed precision, preparing for the consecration, when the cheap plastic phone in the sacristy shrieked. It was a jarring, profane sound, a raw, insistent intrusion that tore through the sacred hush like a jagged rip in fine silk. My parish secretary, Father Michael, usually a woman of unflappable calm, appeared at the sacristy door, her face a sheet of paper drained of all color. Her voice, when she managed to speak, was a thin, reedy whisper, barely audible above the insistent ring. She held the receiver away from her ear, as if it were spitting fire, or some venomous truth she dared not embrace. "The warden," she mouthed, her eyes wide, glistening with alarm, reflecting the muted light in perfect, horrified circles. An unspoken dread, cold and sharp, passed between us, a premonition of something utterly, fundamentally wrong. I took the receiver. It was surprisingly heavy, cold in my hand, as if it had been waiting to deliver this grim message all morning. The voice on the other end wasn't merely angry. It was a frantic, raw bellow of fury and disbelief, crackling with static that felt like electricity arcing across my own skin. A physical assault on my ears and my composure. "Father, what in God's name are you playing at?" The warden's words were a barrage, each one a hammer blow, laced with a dangerous, unstable edge that spoke of absolute power challenged. "What kind of sick, twisted blasphemy is this? Marcus Gallo, he's locked down, secured in his solitary cell, under armed guard, awaiting the final walk. Do you hear me, Father? He is not due out until the executioner calls. Precisely 5 minutes after 6. My blood ran cold, freezing in my veins. The phone, a simple instrument of mundane communication, felt like a block of ice, then a lead weight in my hand. The absolute, unshakable certainty in his voice, the frantic desperation underlying his fury, pressed down on me, stealing the breath from my lungs, crushing me. For a moment my mind refused to reconcile the sound with the sight, the warden's impossible truth with the impossible truth unfolding before my very eyes. A silent prayer, a choked, desperate plea for understanding, formed on my lips, but no sound emerged. My throat was tight, my chest aching, because even as his frantic accusations hammered at my ear, my eyes, without conscious command, were fixed on the impossible. Marcus Gallo was standing not 10 feet from me. He was right there, visible, solid, his presence in the sanctuary as undeniable as the altar itself, as real as the wooden crucifix above it. I blinked, then blinked again, trying to shake away what surely had to be a hallucination, a cruel trick of the dawn light. But he remained, clad not in the pristine white alb of an altar server, but in his faded orange prison jumpsuit, its cheap, coarse fabric, a grotesque splash of raw, unsettling color against the solemn white of the altar cloth and the warm, holy glow of the sanctuary lamp. The sight of it was a searing anomaly, an offense to all rational thought, a stark, violent discord in the quiet harmony of the Mass. His gaunt frame was unmistakable even beneath the unflattering fabric. He held the cruet of water. His hands, which should have been shackled, were steady, perfectly still. His movements, which should have been twitching with the terror of impending death, were fluid, imbued with a profound, almost beatific serenity, a peace that should not have been possible, not for a man hours from death, not for a man who should have been miles away, behind impregnable walls of steel, glass, and concrete, in a cell I knew intimately from our many sessions. Yet, there he was. His dark eyes, once filled with such searing despair, now held a deep, quiet light I had never witnessed before. The congregation, they had turned. Slowly, one by one, their gazes drawn not to me, the priest standing bewildered at the altar, but to him. The shift was almost imperceptible at first, a ripple through the pews, then a collective, dawning horror. Mrs. O'Malley's worn wooden rosary beads lay forgotten in her lap, her mouth forming a silent, "Oh my God!" Young Thomas's tattered missal slipped from his small, trembling fingers, hitting the floor with a soft thud that, in the profound silence, echoed like a cannon shot. Old Mr. Henderson merely stared, his usually shrewd eyes wide with a mixture of raw terror and unadulterated awe, his jaw slack. They saw him. They all saw him. The condemned man. The man everyone knew was set to die. And yet, he was here. He was here. How could he be? How could a man locked in a maximum security cell, awaiting the ultimate sentence, be simultaneously present in a humble parish church miles away, assisting at the altar? Two places, two realities, both utterly true, both utterly impossible. My mind reeled, grasping for any logical thread, any sliver of a rational explanation, but there was none. The narrative loop began there, a knot in time, in space, in faith. It started with that impossible contradiction, that unholy paradox playing out before my very eyes. I don't pretend to fully understand it, even now, years later, after all that has transpired. The explanation, if one can call it that, lies in what came after, what unfolded in the silent, miraculous moments that followed. But I saw it, I witnessed it, and I stood there, a priest, utterly stripped of explanation, watching a condemned man exist in two places at once. This is not a tale of faith rewarded, not yet. This is a tale of faith utterly shattered, then rebuilt. Not gently, but by a hammer blow of the divine. You won't believe it. I barely do myself. But it happened, and it changed everything. The warden's voice, a harsh static against the fragile morning calm, had torn a hole in the fabric of what I understood to be reality. It was a contradiction that defied every law of nature and every tenet of the human condition, a knot in the timeline of a man's fate. That image of Marcus, serene and luminous in his orange jumpsuit, assisting me at the altar, while simultaneously locked away in his cell, burned itself into my mind's eye. It was, as I said, a hammer blow of the divine, a moment of such profound impossibility that it shattered my earthly understanding of faith and rebuilt it from the ground up. But for that story to truly unfold, for the impossible to take its rightful, miraculous place, we must first go back to a different kind of confinement, a different kind of darkness. Before the miracle, before the impossible made manifest, there was simply Marcus. And before Marcus became the quiet, contemplative soul who knelt beside me at the altar, he was a creature forged in the fires of despair, a soul so thoroughly beaten by life that he had become brittle, sharp-edged, and utterly resistant to the light. It was a year before that impossible morning that I first walked into the state penitentiary, a place where hope was a foreign language, rarely spoken, quickly forgotten. The air itself seemed to sag under the weight of lost dreams and bitter regrets, thick with the metallic tang of old steel, industrial cleaner, and something else, a faint, persistent scent of resignation, like dust settling on forgotten things. The clang of the heavy gates locking behind me always sent a shiver down my spine, a stark reminder of the invisible, impenetrable walls that separated one world from another. I was a priest, a shepherd called to wander into the darkest valleys, but even I felt the chill of that place seep into my bones, a cold that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the human spirit. My mission that day, indeed for the many days that followed, was to meet Marcus Gallo. His name had become synonymous with a brutal crime that had rocked our community, a senseless act of violence against a young family that left a deep, festering wound in the collective conscience of our state. The headlines had painted him as a monster, the prosecution's case a meticulous unraveling of forensic evidence so damning, so utterly conclusive, that his guilt was, as the papers loved to declare, a foregone conclusion. There was no doubt in anyone's mind, save perhaps his own, though even that seemed a fragile flicker against the overwhelming consensus. I remember the first time I saw him through the thick reinforced glass of the visitation room. It was a sterile, impersonal space, designed to prevent connection rather than foster it. A rough, pockmarked metal table separated us, a barrier as much psychological as physical. Marcus was brought in by a burly guard, his wrists and ankles still shackled, though they were removed once he was seated opposite me. He moved with a kind of weary defiance, his shoulders hunched, but his head held just high enough to meet my gaze with a challenge. He was younger than I expected, barely 30, though the lines etched around his eyes and mouth spoke of a much older soul. His eyes, though shadowed, held an intelligent, almost feral glint, like a trapped animal. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much, endured too much, and trusted too little. He wore the standard-issue orange jumpsuit, which did little to flatter or distinguish him, yet there was an intensity about him, a coiled energy that belied his slumped posture. I extended my hand, palm open, a simple gesture of welcome, though the glass prevented any physical contact. "Marcus," I said, my voice intentionally soft, an offering of peace in that harsh place. "I'm Father Michael. Thank you for agreeing to see me." He didn't return the gesture. Instead, he simply stared, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze before it hardened into a wall of cynicism. A slow, weary sigh escaped him, laced with a bitter amusement. "Father Michael," he repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Another one. They never stop, do they? The parade of do-gooders, the soul savages, the professional handholders. What do you want, Father? More importantly, why are you even here?" His voice was a gravelly rasp, not loud, but imbued with a weary venom that cut through the silence of the room. It was clear he viewed me as just another cog in the machinery of his impending demise, another functionary dispatched to prepare him for the gallows, a spiritual undertaker. I kept my hand extended for another beat, then gently lowered it, choosing my words carefully. "I'm here to listen, Marcus, to be with you if you'll allow it, and to offer whatever comfort I can, should you seek it." He scoffed, a short, sharp burst of air that was more derision than laughter. "Comfort? Is that what they call it now? Here I was thinking you were the holy janitor, sent to scrub my soul clean before they toss it out with the garbage. Save yourself the effort, Father. My soul, if I even have one left, is beyond your mop and bucket." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Unless, of course, you've come with some miraculous evidence that clears my name. Some forgotten witness, a last-minute confession from the real killer?" His voice dripped with sarcasm, each word a carefully aimed dart. My heart ached for him. Not for the man the world condemned, but for the terrified young man I sensed beneath the brittle shell of anger and cynicism. I saw past the sharp tongue, past the defiant sneer, to the profound despair that had taken root in his spirit, twisting him into a shape he barely recognized himself. His anger was a shield, a ragged, worn-out defense against a world that had, he believed, utterly abandoned him. "I have no such evidence, Marcus," I admitted, my voice steady, devoid of judgment. "My task is not of this world's justice, but of a different kind. I believe in redemption even when all seems lost." He threw his head back and let out a short, hollow laugh that echoed unnervingly in the sterile room. "Redemption? For me? They say I'm a monster, Father, a cold-blooded killer. The state has decided my redemption will be found in a needle, in a quiet, sterile death. Don't waste your breath, or your prayers, on a lost cause like me." He shifted, his gaze darting around the room, avoiding mine for a moment, and in that fleeting evasion, I caught a glimpse of something raw and vulnerable. Then his eyes locked back onto mine, fierce and desperate. "I didn't do it, Father," he whispered, the words barely audible, a stark contrast to his earlier venom. It wasn't a plea for belief, but a confession of a different kind, a confession of his own enduring, unshakable truth, spoken not to convince me, but perhaps to remind himself. "I swear to you, before whatever God you believe in, I did not do what they say I did." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken pain. He spoke of his innocence not with the theatrical outrage of a man trying to convince a jury, but with the quiet, desperate certainty of a soul crying out in the wilderness, knowing no one would ever truly hear him. He knew the evidence was stacked against him, that the world had already rendered its final verdict. He simply had no other way to articulate the injustice that had swallowed his life whole. I felt a profound sadness settle over me, a familiar companion in these chambers. Marcus was a man trapped not just by prison walls, but by the impenetrable web of circumstance, forensic data, and public perception. He was the perfect scapegoat, a man with a difficult past, a history of bad choices that, while not leading to murder, made him an easy target for suspicion. He had no alibi, no witnesses, no friends left to speak for him. The few family members he had were estranged, broken by their own struggles, and by the shame his conviction had brought upon them. He was truly alone, a man abandoned by everyone he had ever known, left to rot in the cold embrace of the justice system. "I hear you, Marcus," I said simply. And I believe that everyone, no matter their past, deserves to be heard. He snorted, a fresh wave of cynicism washing over his face. Heard? They heard the prosecutor. They heard the experts. They heard the grieving family. My voice was drowned out, Father, before I even opened my mouth. It's always been that way for me. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong name. He ran a hand through his short, unkempt hair, his eyes closing for a moment as if warding off an invisible blow. I'm just a convenient answer, an easy narrative for a town that needed someone to blame. His words, though harsh, resonated with a deeper truth I'd encountered countless times in these halls. The desperate plea of a person whose identity had been stripped away and replaced by a crime, a label, a number. My heart ached, not with pity, but with a profound empathy for the human condition, for the fragility of reputation, for the ease with which a life can unravel. I left that day with a heavy spirit, but also with a quiet resolve. Marcus Gallo was not the monster the headlines proclaimed, not entirely. He was a man consumed by anger, yes, but beneath that rage lay a terrified young man, a broken soul crying out for something he couldn't name, a man who swore his innocence to me in whispers, even as he scoffed at my presence. The path ahead, I knew, would be long and arduous, a spiritual excavation in the coldest, most barren soil. But a seed had been planted, however small, however resistant. He had not thrown me out, and he had, in his own desolate way, spoken his truth. This was not the end of our conversation. It was only the beginning of a journey into the heart of his profound, unsettling darkness. A journey I was prepared to walk, step by painful step. The journey into the heart of Marcus's profound, unsettling darkness was indeed a trek, step by painful step, through arid lands where the light of hope seemed only a distant, mocking shimmer. My own soul felt the parched earth beneath its feet with each visit, the emotional terrain unforgiving and stark. The early months of our acquaintance followed a predictable, yet no less draining pattern. I would arrive at the penitentiary, the very air within its outer gates feeling heavy, laden with the weight of forgotten lives and unspoken regrets. I'd navigate the sterile corridors that hummed with a low, oppressive energy, a pervasive vibration beneath my worn shoes, a mechanical sigh that seemed to emanate from the very concrete. The air itself was a peculiar blend of industrial cleaner, stale humanity, and an indefinable scent of confinement, a smell that clung to my vestments long after I'd left. Overhead, fluorescent lights cast a harsh, unforgiving glow, stripping color and warmth from everything they touched, leaving behind only shadows and sharp angles. The clanging of gates, often echoing from unseen passages, struck me like a mournful bell, marking not time, but the relentless progression of despair. Each heavy thud was a reminder of the barriers, both physical and spiritual, that separated Marcus from the world and from himself. I'd be led to the visitation room, a small, windowless box that felt more like a forgotten cupboard than a place of human interaction. The metal table, bolted immovably to the floor, bore the scratches and scars of countless previous encounters, each mark a silent testament to frustrations, tears, and bitter words. The two chairs, unpadded and cold, offered no comfort. Only the rigid posture of confrontation or resignation. There, Marcus would be waiting, often with a sneer already forming on his lips, a familiar twist of cynicism that pulled down the corners of his mouth and hardened his eyes. His posture was usually hunched, shoulders rounded in a perpetual defensive crouch, as if bracing against an unseen blow. He was a creature of habit in his despair, and his initial resistance was a thick, thorny hedge around his soul, designed to keep out any hint of vulnerability, any possibility of connection. "What good is this, Father?" he'd often begin, his voice a low growl that barely masked the tremor beneath, a vulnerability he desperately tried to conceal. "You can't absolve a ghost, and that's what I am. A ghost of a man, waiting for the state to flick off the lights." He'd challenge my very presence, his eyes holding a challenging glint, searching for any sign of weakness in my resolve. He called me a vulture, sent to pick clean the bones of his faith, a peddler of pie in the sky to soothe the condemned. His words were sharp, honed by years of bitterness, and though they stung, I understood their genesis. He was testing me, pushing away what he feared he didn't deserve. I never argued. To engage in a battle of wits or theology would have been to validate his anger as a rational argument, rather than what it truly was, a manifestation of profound pain. Instead, I simply listened, my gaze steady, my presence a silent, unwavering anchor in his storm. I allowed his venom to spend itself against my quiet patience, absorbing the blows with a deep internal sigh and a whispered prayer. I understood, in a way, that his anger was a shield, a last desperate attempt to feel something potent in a life utterly devoid of power. It was the only agency he felt he had left, the only way to assert his existence in a world that had stripped him of everything else. Each visit was a slow, meticulous chipping away at that shield, not with sermons or scripture, for such tools would have been instantly rejected, but with genuine, unwavering presence. I offered him the simple, radical act of being seen and heard, without judgment or expectation. I learned to discern the subtle shifts in his mood, the flicker in his eyes when he spoke of a memory, however bitter, a slight softening around his mouth when he recalled a forgotten detail, a momentary lapse in his defensive posture. He was a man drowning, and every word he uttered, every caustic remark, was a gasp for air, a plea to be seen, truly seen, for the man beneath the monstrous reputation, the layers of accusation and despair. I saw him, not as his crime, not as the headlines painted him, but as a son of God, however lost, however profoundly broken. My heart ached for him, recognizing the universal human struggle for dignity and belonging, even in such a desolate place. I prayed for him constantly, offering up the ache in my own chest for the redemption of his. As the weeks bled into months, a gray, indistinct flow of time within those walls, the world outside that prison began to forget Marcus Gallo. Or rather, it settled into the grim certainty of his fate. His name, once splashed across evening news and newspaper fronts, faded into the background noise of public memory. But within those walls, the machinery of justice, slow and inexorable, continued its grind. His final appeals were systematically denied, each one a hammer blow to his flickering hope, driving him deeper into the abyss of his appointed end. I remember the day the first one came back, a thick envelope with the official seal, delivered by a weary guard who seemed to carry the sorrow of all the condemned within his stooped shoulders. It lay on the cold metal table between us, an inert object of dread. Marcus, who usually affected an air of indifference, a practiced aloofness, tore it open with trembling hands. His fingers, usually steady despite their calluses, fumbled with the paper, betraying the raw anxiety beneath his tough facade. He read the terse legal jargon, his face draining of color, the ruddy glow of his skin replaced by an ashen pallor. Then, with a sudden violent motion, he crumpled the paper into a tight ball, throwing it with surprising force against the concrete wall. The dull thud echoed in the small room, a sound of impotent rage. "Denied," he whispered, a guttural sound that seemed torn from the very bedrock of his being, from a place where hope had already begun to calcify. Of course, denied. What did I expect? A miracle? From them? He gestured vaguely towards the outside world, his hand shaking slightly, a world he believed had already condemned him beyond redemption, a world that had no room for second chances for men like him. He laughed then, a harsh, brittle sound devoid of humor, laced with pure, unadulterated cynicism that chilled me to the bone. "They want their pound of flesh, Father, and they're going to get it." My heart sank with each word, feeling the weight of his utter defeat. I sat there, my own breath shallow, offering what little comfort my silence could provide, and praying for a strength I knew neither of us truly possessed at that moment. The denial of his second appeal was worse. There was no theatrical rage this time, no crumpled paper thrown in defiance. He simply stared at the document, its legal pronouncements forming an impenetrable wall between him and any possibility of freedom, his eyes vacant, as if looking through the words to some unspeakable void beyond. His shoulders slumped further, his entire frame seeming to shrink within the confines of his prison-issue jumpsuit. A profound stillness settled over him, more terrifying than any outburst. It was then that the spiritual desolation truly began to set in, a chilling fog that crept into every corner of his being, obscuring even the faintest glimmer of light. It was a desolation far deeper than mere sadness or anger. It was the slow, deliberate extinguishing of the very flame of his spirit. He would sit across from me, his shoulders now perpetually slumped, his gaze fixed on some point in the distant past, or perhaps on a future he no longer bothered to imagine. He'd begin to speak, not to me directly but as if to the empty air, or to the very walls that imprisoned him, his voice sometimes barely above a whisper, sometimes laced with a quiet, simmering bitterness. "A loving God, you say?" He challenged me one afternoon, his voice thin, reedy, utterly without its usual bite. The lack of his customary aggression was unnerving, signaling a deeper wound. "Where was this loving God when I was a kid, Father? When my old man walked out, leaving my mother to work herself to death, leaving me to raise my little sister in that rat-trap apartment?" He recounted the story of his life, not as a confession but as an indictment, a litany of grievances against a world he felt had dealt him an impossibly cruel hand. A string of bad choices, he called them. But in his retelling they sounded more like the only choices available to a boy caught in a relentless current, swept along by forces far greater than himself. He spoke of hunger, not just for food, though that too was a constant companion, but for dignity, for recognition, for a fair shake, for a chance to break free from the cycle of poverty and despair. He spoke of school truancy, not out of rebelliousness, but because he was out working odd jobs, his small, unformed hands toiling to keep the lights on, trying to buy shoes for his sister so she wouldn't be ashamed to go to school. He spoke of the allure of the streets, not for glamour or excitement, but for a warped sense of belonging, for the fleeting promise of respect among those who had nothing to lose, who understood the language of deprivation. He fell in with the wrong crowd, of course. They offered me a place, Father, a place when no one else would. My family was broken. The system ignored us, and the church, well, the church was just a pretty building we passed on the way to the pawn shop. His voice grew stronger then, fueled by the embers of an old, deep-seated resentment, a smoldering fire that years of imprisonment had only intensified. I never asked for much, just a fair shake, but fair isn't a word they use for guys like me. We're born guilty, Father. Born with the wrong name, in the wrong part of town, with the wrong color skin in the wrong kind of family. His words painted a vivid, heartbreaking picture of a life on the margins, a constant struggle against an unseen current, pushing him inexorably towards the very precipice where he now found himself. The murder, he maintained, was a setup, a twisted turn of events that placed him, the easy target, at the scene of the crime. Wrong place, wrong time, Father. That's been the story of my life. And they strung me up, just like they wanted to. Convenient scapegoat. He raged against a God he claimed not to believe in, yet to whom he directed all his bitter questions, his anguished pleas for an explanation. If there's a God, Father, a loving Father, then why did he let my mother die in that hospital bed, worn out before her time, while I was sitting in juvie for a crime I didn't even commit then? Why did he let my sister drift away, become a ghost in her own right? And why does he sit by and watch while an innocent man is paraded to his death, his face contorted, not just with anger, but with a profound, aching sorrow that seemed to rip through the hardened shell of his cynicism? The raw pain of a life perceived as utterly forsaken poured out of him, a torrent of suffering that felt almost unbearable to witness. I did not offer him easy answers or false hope of a legal reprieve. To do so would have been to insult the brutal reality of his situation, to undermine the fragile trust we were slowly, painstakingly building. There were no glib assurances about God's plan, no hollow platitudes about everything happening for a reason. To speak such words in the face of his anguish would have been a betrayal of my calling, a denial of his lived experience. Instead, I simply sat with him in his darkness. I allowed his words to wash over me, to wound me, to stir my own soul with questions about suffering and justice that, even as a priest, I had no easy answers for. My presence became a silent vow. You are not alone in this pit. I will bear witness to your pain. I will sit with you in this profound injustice, and together, in this silence, perhaps we can find a flicker of something true, something that transcends the limitations of human law and human understanding. I would offer him the sacrament of presence, the quiet comfort of another human being willing to share the crushing weight of his reality. There were days when he simply stared out, past me, past the walls, into a future that was shrinking, darkening with each passing moment. The execution date had been set, a chilling, stark reality that hung in the air between us like an invisible shroud, like the heavy, final breath of a dying man. It was no longer a hypothetical terror. It was a fixed point on a calendar, a countdown to state-sanctioned death that loomed larger and more terrifying with each sunrise. The encroaching shadow of that day began to consume him, and by extension, me. I felt the weight of it, the cold, existential dread that seeped into the very fibers of the penitentiary and into my own spirit. I would leave him after our visits, my own spirit heavy, sometimes bruised by the sheer force of his despair, but never broken. I'd walk back through the gates, out into the setting sun, where the world outside seemed vibrant, oblivious to the grim countdown playing out within the prison walls. The golden light of evening would feel almost sacrilegious after the stark interior I'd left, and I would pray fervently for Marcus, for his soul, for a peace that seemed impossible in the face of such injustice. I prayed not for his release, not for a legal loophole, for those avenues were now closed. Instead, I prayed for a divine intervention that transcended human courts and human failings, for a truth to be revealed, for a heart to be touched, for a flicker of light to penetrate the impenetrable darkness of his cell, of his soul. Because in that darkness, that utter human helplessness, when all earthly avenues were exhausted, when a man had been stripped bare of every last shred of worldly hope, sometimes, only then, does the divine truly make itself known. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that Marcus Gallo was on the precipice of something profound. He was stripped bare, utterly devoid of any self-reliance or earthly hope, and it was in that very emptiness, I believed, that God might finally find a way in. The darkness I spoke of, that impenetrable gloom that had settled over Marcus Gallo's soul, only deepened in the weeks that followed. The legal avenues, once flickering with the faintest possibility of reprieve, began to close one by one, with the resounding finality of an iron door being slammed shut. Each denial, each rejected appeal was not merely a legal setback, it was a physical blow to a spirit already teetering on the brink. I remember the day the Supreme Court announced its refusal to hear his case. It came through a phone call to the prison, a sterile, bureaucratic voice relaying the news to the warden, who in turn conveyed it to Marcus with a grim, almost pitying neutrality. I was there, as I always tried to be, for the aftermath of such news. Usually these moments would ignite a fresh blaze of anger in Marcus. A furious, impotent rage against a system he perceived as rigged, against a God he felt had utterly forsaken him. He would rail, he would curse, his words a desperate, clawing scream against the injustice. But this time, there was nothing. No fire, no fury, just an absolute, terrifying stillness. It was as if the last ember of his defiance had been doused, leaving behind only ash. His face, usually taut with tension or contempt, went slack, and his eyes, which had held a flicker of desperate cunning even in despair, became vacant, as if the light within had simply gone out. He looked at me, then through me, as if I were a ghost, a remnant of a world he no longer inhabited. "It's over, Father," he rasped, his voice thin, like a whisper carried on a distant wind. "It's truly over." And it was. The execution date was set, 3 weeks hence. 3 short weeks until the state, in its cold, righteous judgment, would extinguish the life of a man who, to me, remained an enigma, a puzzle of despair and denial, but undeniably a child of God, no less worthy of compassion. I tried to speak, to offer words of comfort, of spiritual solace, but they felt hollow, inadequate in the face of such absolute defeat. How do you console a man whose very existence has been sentenced to oblivion? How do you speak of hope when all earthly hope has been systematically eradicated? I sat with him in silence for a long time that day, my own heart heavy, burdened by the immense, crushing weight of his finality. After that day, Marcus withdrew entirely. He refused to leave his cell for exercise, refused his meager meals, refused to see visitors. Most agonizingly for me, he refused to see Mio. For a full week, my requests for a visit were met with the same terse answer from the guards. Gallo says no. Each day I would approach the warden, plead with the chaplain's office, try every channel available, only to be met with the same wall of resistance. "He just lies there, Father," one of the more sympathetic guards told me, his voice lowered, a hint of unease in his tone. "Doesn't speak, just stares at the ceiling, like he's already gone." That week was a crucible for my own faith. I walked the labyrinthine corridors of the prison, my steps echoing in the hollow silence, a sense of profound helplessness gnawing at my soul. Had I failed him? Had my presence, my gentle persistence, ultimately been for naught? Had I merely witnessed his descent into the abyss, powerless to offer a hand strong enough to pull him back? I spent hours in the small, austere prison chapel, kneeling before the simple crucifix, my prayers becoming less articulate, more a series of groans and sighs from the depth of my being. I prayed for Marcus, yes, for a breakthrough, for a sign, but I also prayed for myself, for the strength to continue, for the wisdom to know what to do when all human remedies had failed. I thought of the parable of the lost sheep, of the shepherd who leaves the 99 to go after the one. Marcus was that one, lost, and now it seemed unwilling to be found. The thought of him alone in that cold cell, consumed by despair, was a torment. It was a darkness I couldn't reach, a silence I couldn't break. I imagined the weight of the world pressing down on him, the collective judgment of a society, the spectral faces of his accusers, the crushing burden of his own perceived failures. He was a man utterly shipwrecked, adrift in a sea of hopelessness, with no shore in sight. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a call came through. It was the warden himself, his voice unusually subdued. "He'll see you, Father." For 15 minutes. He didn't ask for it, but he didn't refuse when I offered. "Just don't expect much." I dressed quickly, my cassock feeling heavy. I stole a familiar comfort against the sudden tremor in my hands. The drive to the penitentiary felt longer than usual, the familiar landscape blurring past my peripheral vision. My mind was consumed with a single thought. What would I find? And what, if anything, could I possibly say? The journey through the prison's sterile environment was always a sensory assault. The clang of steel doors, the harsh fluorescent lights, the faint metallic scent that permeated everything. But this time, it felt different. A pall seemed to hang in the air, a collective holding of breath. The guards spoke in hushed tones, their faces etched with the weary resignation that comes from proximity to death. When the heavy door to Marcus's solitary cell finally swung open, revealing the small concrete box within, the sight of him was worse than I had imagined. He wasn't raging, wasn't weeping, wasn't even angry. He was simply gone. His body was there, slumped on the edge of the cot. But the man I knew, even in his cynicism and despair, was absent. He was thinner, his cheekbones stark beneath skin that had taken on a grayish pallor. His eyes, fixed on the opposite wall, were sunken and devoid of any spark. The week of self-imposed isolation, of starvation, of utter spiritual surrender, had taken a devastating toll. He was hollowed out, as if an essential part of him had been painstakingly scooped away, leaving only an empty vessel. I sat on the stool opposite him, the air thick with unspoken anguish. The silence was not peaceful. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket. I waited. I prayed. I simply allowed my presence to fill a small corner of his immense emptiness. Moments stretched into what felt like an eternity. I contemplated speaking, but what words could pierce such an impenetrable void? Words felt like pebbles thrown into an ocean. Then, my gaze fell upon my own hands, clasped in my lap. My fingers traced the familiar contours of the rosary I had carried for decades, a simple string of smooth, worn wooden beads, darkened by the oil of my skin, polished by countless prayers. It was a gift from my grandmother on my ordination day, a physical testament to a lineage of faith, a constant companion through every joy and sorrow of my priesthood. It represented an unbroken chain of intercession, a constant connection to the Mother. A sudden clear thought, as vivid and undeniable as a bell chiming in the quiet, entered my mind. Give it to him. Hesitantly, carefully, I unclasped the rosary from my fingers. Marcus still hadn't acknowledged my presence, his gaze lost somewhere beyond the concrete wall. I reached across the small space separating us, my hand gently extended, the rosary draped over my palm. "Marcus," I said, my voice soft, almost a whisper, yet it seemed to cut through the oppressive silence. He stirred, slowly, his head turning incrementally until his vacant eyes finally, reluctantly, rested on my outstretched hand, and then on the simple wooden beads. A flicker of something crossed his face. Not curiosity, not anger, but perhaps a ghost of the old contempt, weary and without sting. He looked at the rosary as if it were an alien object, something utterly irrelevant to his current state of desolation. "What's that, Father?" he asked, his voice hoarse, barely audible. "Another prop? Something to ward off the demons you think are here?" A mirthless chuckle escaped him, more a dry cough than laughter. "It's a rosary, Marcus," I replied, my voice steady, betraying none of the tremor in my heart. "My rosary." I pushed it gently into his hand. His fingers, surprisingly light and cold, closed around it. He didn't grasp it with conviction, but he didn't recoil either. The beads lay inert in his palm, a small, tangible anchor in his vast internal sea of nothingness. "What good is it?" he mumbled, his eyes still fixed on the wood, as if expecting it to somehow reveal its purpose. "Prayer hasn't helped me. God hasn't heard a single one of my prayers. Why would a string of beads make any difference now?" I knew better than to offer theological lectures, or to argue against his bitter experience. His journey through suffering had stripped him bare of the language of faith as he understood it. I looked at him, at the profound weariness etched into every line of his face, at the desperation lurking beneath his hollow gaze. "Marcus," I began, choosing my words with care, "I know you feel abandoned. I know you feel that your prayers have gone unheard, that God has turned his face from you, and perhaps in your pain, it feels that way. But sometimes, when we feel we cannot speak directly to the Father, when our own voices are too broken, too choked with despair, we can speak to the Mother." I paused, allowing my words to hang in the air, watching for any flicker of recognition. He continued to stare at the rosary, a faint furrow appearing between his brows. "The Mother, Marcus," I continued, pressing on gently. "Our Blessed Mother, Mary, she knows suffering. She watched her own son endure unimaginable pain, humiliation, and death. She knows what it is to stand by, helpless, as a loved one faces injustice. She understands the pleas of all her sons, especially the forgotten ones, the ones on the edges, the ones society has cast aside." I remembered my grandmother, her gnarled fingers always busy with her own rosary, her lips moving silently, a perpetual prayer. She had taught me that Mary was a bridge, a gentle advocate, someone whose maternal heart could hear even the most desperate, inarticulate cries. "When your heart feels too heavy to pray for yourself, Marcus," I said, leaning forward slightly, my voice imbued with a quiet intensity. "When you feel you have no words left, no strength to lift your own spirit, give her your burden. Ask her to intercede for you. She is always listening. She carries our prayers to her son, and her son never denies his mother." He didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different, less oppressive, more pregnant with possibility. He rotated the rosary in his palm, the smooth beads rubbing against his skin. I could see the barest hint of thought returning to his eyes, a struggle within. Contempt still lingered, yes, the bitter taste of a lifetime of disappointment. But beneath it, perhaps, a tremor of curiosity, a faint, almost unconscious grasping for something, anything, that might offer a reprieve from the crushing weight of nothingness. His fingers tightened ever so slightly around the wooden beads. It wasn't a fervent embrace, not a sudden conversion. It was something far more primal, far more desperate. It was the instinctive grip of a drowning man clutching at a piece of driftwood. He wasn't reaching for faith, he was reaching for survival. Not survival of the body, for that seemed beyond reach, but survival of the spirit, a tiny, almost involuntary act of clinging to the very last, most improbable strand of hope in a universe that had seemed to abandon him completely. He did not throw the beads back at me. He simply closed his fist around them, his knuckles stark white against his pale skin, holding them as if they were the only thing keeping him from sinking entirely beneath the waves. And in that simple, desperate act, a tiny, almost imperceptible seed of something new was planted in the barren soil of his soul. A tiny, fragile opening in the darkness. The weight of that rosary, clutched in Marcus's desperate hand, stayed with me as I walked away from the visitation room that day. And in the quiet hours that followed, through all the agonizing final preparations, it was a tangible thread connecting me to a soul teetering on the precipice. A thread woven not of certainty, but of raw, primal need. That tiny, fragile opening in the darkness, I prayed, would not be swallowed whole by the night. The evening of the execution, the air in the prison felt different, heavy, stagnant, like breath held too long. Even the guards, usually brusque and detached, moved with a subdued solemnity. The sterile corridors, usually echoing with the clang of doors and distant shouts, were hushed, amplifying the dread that clung to the very stones. It was a place where life was systematically extinguished, and on nights like this, the machinery of that process became horrifyingly palpable. My heart, accustomed as it was to ministering to the dying, still ached with a unique, profound sorrow for the young man I was about to see. I was escorted through a labyrinth of locked gates and cold steel, deeper into the bowels of the institution, past cells where other condemned men waited, their faces shadowed, their fates mirroring Marcus's own. Each glance, each silent nod from a guard, was a grim acknowledgement of the journey I was on, and the finality of my destination. The small chamber where Marcus was held was what they called the Death Watch cell, an isolated box just steps away from the execution room itself. It was designed to prevent any last-minute escape, any desperate act, but I knew Marcus wasn't planning escape. He was preparing for a different kind of journey. When the heavy door finally clanged open and I stepped inside, the immediate contrast between the oppressive atmosphere outside and the stillness within Marcus's cell was startling. The room was bare save for a narrow cot and a small bolted-down steel table. A single bare bulb cast a harsh, unforgiving light. And there, sitting on the edge of the cot, was Marcus. He wasn't huddled in a corner, raging against the injustice, or trembling with terror as I might have expected. He was sitting upright, his hands resting lightly in his lap, his gaze fixed on the concrete wall opposite him, as if contemplating something profound etched into its stark surface. His orange jumpsuit, the uniform of the condemned, seemed to hang loosely on his now slender frame. But it was his face that truly startled me. The gauntness was still there, the hollows beneath his cheekbones, the faint shadows under his eyes, but the cynical sneer, the desperate defiance, the weary resignation, all of it was gone. In its place was a serenity so absolute, so profound it stole my breath. It wasn't a forced calm, not the glassy-eyed stupor of someone drugged or in shock. It was a deep, quiet peace that seemed to emanate from within him, softening the harsh lines of his face, illuminating his eyes with a gentle, almost luminous quality I had never seen before. His hands, no longer clenched in tight fists, rested open, palms upward, as if in an act of surrender, or perhaps acceptance. I walked a few steps towards him, my own heart thrumming with a mixture of awe and trepidation. "Marcus," I murmured, my voice a little husky. He turned his head slowly, his gaze meeting mine. There was no accusation, no bitterness, only a profound stillness. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "Father Michael," he said, his voice quiet, steady, stripped of its usual rough edges. "You came." "Of course I came," I replied, pulling up the small, wobbly stool that served as a chair in these visits. "I wouldn't be anywhere else." I paused, searching his face, trying to reconcile the man before me with the one I had known for so long. "You seem different." He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. His eyes, no moment ago fixed on the blank wall, now found the simple wooden rosary I wore around my wrist, the very one I had pressed into his hand weeks ago. "It's the beads, Father," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet clear in the oppressive silence. He then lifted his right hand, slowly unfurling his fingers, and there, nestled in his palm, was my rosary, its worn wooden beads smoothed by countless repetitions, its silver crucifix gleaming faintly in the stark light. "I haven't let go of them since you gave them to me," he confessed, a faint flush rising on his pale cheeks. At first, it was just something to hold, something to focus on. Anything but the clock, anything but the screaming in my head. I just rolled them between my fingers, feeling the wood, counting. Didn't even know the prayers, not really. Just the Hail Mary. That's all I remembered from when I was a kid. From my grandmother. He looked down at the rosary, tracing the outline of the crucifix with his thumb. But then, after a few days, after enough hours of just doing it, the words started to mean something. Not just words, not just sounds. They became a rhythm, a pulse, and then, a voice. Not a voice I heard with my ears, Father, but something deeper, a knowing. He looked up at me again, his eyes wide and earnest. "You told me, when you feel you cannot speak to the Father, speak to the Mother." I didn't get it then. I was so angry at God. How could a loving God let this happen? How could he abandon me? But the Mother, there was something about the Mother. No judgment, just presence. He paused, taking a slow, deep breath, as if drawing in the very air of peace. I started to talk to her, Father. Not just say the prayers, but really talk. Like she was right here. He gestured vaguely to the empty space beside him. I told her everything. All the bad choices, all the wrong turns. The fear, the despair. How alone I felt. How I swore to you I was innocent, but no one else believed me. And it felt like even God had turned his back. His voice cracked, but the tears that welled in his eyes did not fall, held in check by that profound calm. And she listened, he continued, his voice gaining a soft strength. I felt it, Father. Not a booming voice from the sky, not a vision, just a warmth, a comfort, a sense that I wasn't forgotten, that even in this God-forsaken place, in this final hour, I was still her son, that she grieved for me, not with pity, but with a mother's true, deep love. My throat was tight, a lump of emotion lodged there. I simply listened, allowing his words to wash over me, bearing witness to this profound metamorphosis. What did you pray for, Marcus? I finally managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. In those hours, in that silence, what was your heart's truest plea? He looked at me, a glimmer of something akin to awe in his own eyes. It changed, Father, completely. For weeks, months, my prayer was always the same. God, get me out of here. Please, prove my innocence. Don't let me die for something I didn't do. It was selfish, I know, but it was all I had. He gave a small self-deprecating shrug. But then, after enough time with the beads, after enough talking to the Mother, something shifted. I realized, he said, his voice firm, that my life here on earth, my body, it was already gone. They had taken it from me piece by piece. My freedom, my name, my future. They were going to take the last of it tonight. He lifted the rosary, letting it dangle for a moment, catching the light. But my soul, Father, my truth, that was still mine. And that's what I started praying for. Not for my own life anymore. I stopped asking for the bars to open. I stopped asking for a last-minute reprieve. I stopped fighting the inevitable, because the fight was only destroying what little spirit I had left. His gaze became distant, reflective, as if he were seeing beyond the concrete walls, beyond the prison, beyond even this earthly realm. My prayer became this: Mary, Mother of God, let the world know the truth. Not for my sake, not so I can live, but so that my family, the few people left who might remember my name, know I did not do this. Let them know I am not a monster. And, he added, his voice catching, let God know I am not a monster. Let my death not be a lie. Tears, real tears this time, began to trace slow paths down his cheeks, yet his expression remained peaceful. They were not tears of fear, but of profound release, of a purity of purpose. I just want the truth to be known, Father. I want to die with that truth, whatever comes next. My own eyes blurred. The raw honesty, the selfless nature of his final prayer. It was heartbreakingly beautiful. He wasn't asking for a miracle of escape. He was asking for a miracle of vindication, a miracle for his soul's sake, and for the sake of his memory. This was a man who had truly come to terms with his impending death, and in doing so, had found a higher purpose for his last moments. Marcus, I managed, my voice thick with emotion. God hears your prayer. Our Lady hears it. They always do. You have laid bare your soul, and that is all they ask. He nodded, a sigh escaping his lips, as if a great burden had finally been lifted. I know, Father. I feel it. I feel Clean. Then you are ready, I said softly, reaching for my stole and the small pyx I carried. Are you ready to make your confession, my son, and receive our Lord one last time on this earth? He met my gaze, his eyes clear and unwavering. Yes, Father, I am ready. And so, in that desolate cell, under the harsh glare of a single bulb, with the shadow of death hanging heavy in the air, Marcus Gallo made his final confession. He spoke with an honesty that was both shattering and profoundly beautiful, recounting not just the sins of his life but the despair, the fear, the anger that had driven him. He held nothing back. I listened, not as a judge, but as a vessel of Christ's mercy, offering the absolution he so desperately sought, the balm for his wounded soul. His tears flowed freely now, washing away the accumulated guilt and bitterness, leaving behind a profound sense of lightness. Then, with a solemn reverence, I gave him the viaticum, the Holy Eucharist, food for the journey. He received it kneeling on the cold concrete floor, his head bowed, the rosary clutched in his hand. As I administered the body of Christ, his tears streamed down his face, not from sadness but from an overwhelming sense of grace, of union with the divine. It was a moment of transcendent beauty, an act of profound faith in the face of utter earthly defeat. His face, illuminated by that inner peace, glowed with an almost ethereal light. He had made peace with his God, with his fate, and with himself. When I finished, he remained kneeling for a long moment, his lips moving in silent prayer. Then he slowly rose, his gaze finding mine again, filled with an unspoken gratitude. "Thank you, Father," he whispered, his voice hoarse but infused with a quiet strength. "Thank you for not giving up on me." "Never, Marcus," I replied, my own voice thick. "Never." It was time to leave. The guard was already at the door, his shadow falling across the cell. My heart felt heavy, yet simultaneously lightened by the grace I had witnessed. I reached out, placing my hand gently on his shoulder, feeling the fragile strength beneath the jumpsuit. "I will be praying for you, Marcus," I said, my voice low and earnest. "From the moment I leave here until your soul is in God's hands, I will be with you in spirit." He simply nodded, his eyes shining. He reached down, adjusting the rosary in his hand, his fingers resting on the crucifix. "I'll be praying too, Father," he said, that faint, peaceful smile returning. "For truth." As I turned and walked out of the cell, the heavy door clanged shut behind me, the sound echoing through the silence of death row. I glanced back through the small window in the door. Marcus was still sitting on the cot, his posture serene, his face turned towards the wall, his hands cradling the rosary. He was no longer a man raging against his fate, nor a man consumed by fear. He was a man prepared, a man at peace, a man whose final prayer was not for himself, but for a truth that seemed utterly beyond earthly reach. I left him in that cell, clutching the rosary, fully prepared to commend his soul to God at the appointed hour. But as I walked away, a new fragile hope had blossomed in my own heart. A hope not for reprieve, but for something far greater, far more miraculous than I could possibly imagine. He had called out to the Mother, not for his life, but for the truth. And I knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that she had heard him. The morning light was still a rumor on the horizon, a bruised purple bleeding into the deep, unforgiving indigo of pre-dawn. I moved through the sacristy, the familiar smell of old incense, beeswax, and sacred linen a faint comfort against the gnawing anxiety in my heart. 6 o'clock Mass. The hour was approaching. My hands, usually steady as I prepared the chalice and paten, trembled slightly. A part of me, the human, rational part, wrestled with the certainty I had felt last night, that fragile, impossible hope that Mary had heard Marcus. How could she intervene in a way that truly mattered now, with minutes ticking down to an irreversible end? I pushed the doubt away, concentrating on the ritual, allowing the ancient rhythm of the church to envelop me, to be my anchor in a sea of sorrow and dread. The small congregation for daily Mass was gathering, a handful of faithful souls seeking solace at the dawn of a new day. Mrs. Henderson, always in the front pew, her rosary already in hand. Mr. Rossi, quiet and stoic, a widower. A few others, faces etched with the quiet burdens of life. They were my flock, and I, their shepherd, felt the weight of their silent trust and the profound secret burden of Marcus Gallo. I donned my alb and stole, the crisp fabric a cool balm against my skin. I turned to light the altar candles, and then I stopped. My breath hitched, catching in my throat like a shard of ice. Standing beside the altar, to my right, where the acolyte would typically wait with the cruets, was a man. He was clad in an orange jumpsuit, the unmistakable uniform of the state penitentiary. His hair was close-cropped, his frame lean, and his hands, clasped loosely before him, held the cruet of water. It was Marcus. My mind reeled, a kaleidoscope of impossible images. How? I had just left him. sealed in that concrete tomb less than 12 hours ago. The prison was miles away, a fortress of steel and razor wire. My logical mind screamed for an explanation, for a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and grief. But my eyes, wide and unblinking, told me the truth. He was undeniably, miraculously, there. He did not look like a man on death row. He looked transcendent. A profound, almost celestial peace emanated from him, softening the harsh lines of his face, illuminating the hollows beneath his eyes. His gaze was fixed not on me, nor on the small, gasping congregation, but on the altar, on the tabernacle, on a place beyond visible perception. He moved with a quiet dignity, a grace that defied his circumstances. I watched, mesmerized and terrified, as he moved to take his place, settling onto the kneeler at the foot of the altar with a fluidity and reverence I had never taught him. He knew the liturgy, implicitly. He knew where to stand, when to kneel, when to bring the offerings. It was as if he had always belonged there, as if the sacred space had simply drawn him in. A forgotten son finally home. A collective gasp, soft and reverent, rippled through the small nave. Mrs. Henderson's rosary beads clattered to the floor, forgotten. Mr. Rossi's jaw hung slack. Their eyes, wide with a mixture of terror and awe, flickered between Marcus and me, silently pleading for an explanation I could not provide. The air, already heavy with the promise of ritual, became thick with something else now. A palpable energy, the raw, untamed presence of the divine. I forced myself to move, to begin the Mass, my voice a shaky whisper at first, then gaining a strange strength as if carried by a current not my own. With each word of the ancient prayers, the impossibility of Marcus's presence grew, yet so did a profound sense of rightness. The fear that had initially gripped me began to recede, replaced by a deep, vibrating wonder. This was not a nightmare. This was grace. As I reached the consecration, the zenith of the Mass, my hands trembled again, but this time not from fear, but from a holy reverence. I held the host aloft, murmuring the words of institution. Take this, all of you, and eat of it, for this is my body. The wafer, simple and humble, transformed in that moment, becoming the very presence of Christ. Below me, kneeling at the altar, Marcus Gallo's face was upturned, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek, catching the nascent light of the church. It was not a tear of sorrow or despair, but of utter, luminous surrender. His peace was absolute, reflecting a profound communion that transcended the confines of time, space, and human judgment. He was no longer the condemned man. He was simply a soul, bathed in the mercy of God. And as I elevated the chalice, offering the blood of Christ, my gaze inadvertently drifted towards the side door of the sacristy, where my parish secretary, her face ashen, held a landline phone. I could hear the tinny, enraged squawking from the receiver, even across the church. The warden, his voice strained and frantic, a distant, furious counterpoint to the sacred silence that enveloped our small sanctuary. Miles away, in the stark, unforgiving concrete labyrinth of the state penitentiary, another scene was unfolding. Starkly different, yet inextricably linked. The minute hand on the clock in the warden's office clicked inexorably towards 6 a.m. The execution team, grim-faced and professional, stood ready. Warden Thorne, his face a mask of weary resolve, held the heavy ring of keys, the final key to Marcus Gallo's cell gleaming ominously. "All right," he rasped, his voice tight. "Let's get this over with." The air in that long, sterile corridor, usually thick with the metallic tang of fear and despair, seemed unusually cold, brittle. The clack of their boots echoed hollowly. They stopped before cell block C, number 27, Marcus Gallo's cell. With a series of precise, practiced movements, a guard unlatched the heavy, solid steel door, the clang of the bolts reverberating through the silent wing. Warden Thorne inserted the final key, turned it with a sickening clunk, and pushed the door inward. It swung open, revealing the Spartan interior, a steel cot, a thin mattress, a bolted-down toilet. Empty. The guard nearest the door, a burly man named Miller, stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes scanning the narrow confines, then widening in disbelief. "Warden! He's not here!" Thorne scoffed, pushing past him. "Don't be ridiculous, Miller. He's in there. Probably hiding under the cot, playing games." But even as he spoke, a knot of ice formed in his gut. The cell was small. There was nowhere to hide. He stepped inside, his gaze sweeping every inch of the concrete space. The cot was bare, the toilet lid down. The air was still, cold, undisturbed. Marcus Gallo, the condemned man, scheduled to die in minutes, was gone. Simply, utterly gone. A stunned silence descended, broken only by the warden's ragged breathing. His eyes, usually sharp and authoritative, darted around the cell, searching for a sign, a breach, A logical explanation. There was none. The heavy steel door was intact. The bars on the window, thick and unyielding, undisturbed. The walls, solid concrete, showed no sign of tampering. "What in God's name?" Thorn whispered, his voice laced with pure, unadulterated disbelief, bordering on terror. The impossible had just happened. A man, locked in a maximum security cell under constant surveillance, had vanished into thin air. He felt a primal dread crawl up his spine, a sense of something ancient and unexplainable pressing in on him. This was beyond the scope of any protocol, any human understanding. He stumbled back from the cell, his mind racing, trying to grasp at any shred of logic. But there was none, only a gaping void where a man should have been. And as his gaze fell upon the back wall of the cell, where Marcus's cot had been pushed against the rough concrete, his breath hitched again, catching like a snagged thread. The man was gone, but he had not vanished without a trace. He had left something behind, something impossible, something miraculous. And as his gaze fell upon the back wall of the cell, where Marcus's cot had been pushed against the rough concrete, his breath hitched again, catching like a snagged thread. The man was gone, but he had not vanished without a trace. He had left something behind, something impossible, something miraculous. The air in the cell, already thick with the metallic tang of fear and the dust of confinement, seemed to shimmer, drawing the eyes of every man present towards the back wall. Thorn's hand, still clutching the empty cell door, trembled visibly. His guards, initially just as bewildered, now stood transfixed, their initial shouts dying in their throats, replaced by a collective, stunned silence. No one moved. No one spoke. All eyes were fixed on the rough, gray concrete. There, on the very wall where Marcus had spent his final, torturous nights, a miracle had unfolded, burned into the unyielding stone as if by a soft, internal light that emanated from within the rock itself, was an image. It was a perfect, detailed rendering of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Her gaze, so often depicted with a gentle downward cast, seemed to meet their bewildered eyes with an otherworldly compassion. Her blue-green mantle, adorned with golden stars, appeared to flow, though it was etched in static stone. The pink tunic, the black sash signifying her blessed maternity, the gentle crescent moon at her feet, and the cherubic angel supporting her. Every detail was rendered with an impossible fidelity, a vibrant clarity that defied the gray, oppressive nature of the cell. It was not painted, nor drawn. It was as if the very atoms of the concrete had rearranged themselves, illuminated from within by a celestial fire, to bear witness. A guard, a burly man named Johnson who had seen far too much suffering in his career, slowly, almost reverently, reached out a hand. He stopped just shy of touching the image, his calloused fingers hovering in the air. It's glowing," he whispered, his voice a raw, choked sound that barely disturbed the profound silence. And indeed, there was a luminescence, faint but undeniable, a warmth emanating from the stone that was both comforting and terrifying. It was a holy presence, manifesting in a place designed for utter despair. My mind, even miles away, could almost hear the collective gasp, the profound shift in the very atmosphere of that sterile, godless space. These men, hardened by years of witnessing the darkest facets of humanity, were confronted by something utterly divine. It was the face of a mother, gentle and powerful, appearing in the very last place anyone might expect. It was a testament, a visitation, a whisper from the eternal into the temporal. Below the image of the Blessed Mother, etched into the concrete in what forensics would later describe as an inexplicable deposit of carbonized dust, was writing. It was not scrawled or hurried, but clear, deliberate script, almost elegant despite its unusual medium. The warden, Thorn, was the first to approach, his face a mask of awe and dawning dread. He read the words aloud, his voice gaining a strange, tremulous power as he did. It was a complete confession. Every detail of the murder for which Marcus Gallo had been condemned was laid bare. The time, the motive, the method, all confessed with chilling precision. And at the very end, stark against the gray, was a signature, a name that was not Marcus Gallo's. It belonged to another inmate on a different cell block entirely. Thomas the Serpent Rourke. A ripple went through the guards. Rourke was a known quantity, a manipulator, but he had an airtight alibi, or so it had seemed. He had been a witness for the prosecution in Marcus's trial, painting a damning picture of a man he claimed to have known well. Now, the truth, so long buried, had been unveiled by a power beyond human law. Thorn, his face pale, turned from the wall. His gaze swept over his men, and in his eyes I imagined there was a flicker of something new. Not just shock, but perhaps a nascent, terrifying understanding that the universe was far vaster, far more mysterious, than his meticulously ordered world of prison cells and protocols had ever allowed. "Get Rourke," he commanded, his voice hoarse. and bring him here, now." When Thomas Rourke, bewildered and protesting, was dragged to cell block C and shoved into Marcus's now empty cell, his eyes fell upon the wall. The bravado drained from him as if a plug had been pulled. He saw the serene image of Our Lady, her eyes, impossibly, seeming to pierce his very soul. He saw his own name, emblazoned beneath the confession that poured forth the sordid details of his guilt. He crumpled, his knees gave way, and he fell to the concrete floor, a shuddering heap of raw, exposed truth. The denials died in his throat, replaced by guttural sobs, a desperate, broken stream of admissions and pleas for mercy. Our Lady had answered Marcus's prayer. The world would now know the truth. In that moment, the sterile walls of that death row cell had become a sanctuary, a canvas for the divine. The concrete, so symbolic of imprisonment and despair, had been transformed into a tablet of revelation. It was not the cold logic of evidence, nor the measured pronouncements of justice that had brought forth the truth, but a direct divine testimony, a mother's intercession, born from the fervent, desperate prayer of a forgotten son. The impossible contradiction of Marcus's presence in two places had been resolved not by human reasoning, but by the quiet, overwhelming power of God's love, manifested through his blessed mother, and the truth, illuminated by a light no human hand could kindle, was finally made known. The revelation in the cell was, of course, a cataclysm for the state. The discovery of the true killer's confession burned into the very fabric of Marcus's cell wall beneath an impossible image of Our Lady, threw the entire justice system into a maelstrom. The official explanation, a bureaucratic mess of evasions and legalistic jargon, attempted to attribute the exoneration to an unexplained event and newly discovered, though mysteriously acquired, evidence. They spoke of carbonized dust and inexplicable markings, of a sudden conscience-stricken confession from another inmate that conveniently aligned with the forensic anomaly. But for those of us who had witnessed the impossible, both in the hushed solemnity of the sacristy and the stark terror of the death row corridor, the truth was clear, etched not just in stone, but in our very souls. Marcus, no longer a condemned man but a living testament to divine mercy, found himself adrift in a world that barely remembered him, and certainly did not understand the nature of his freedom. He was released not just from the prison's iron grip, but from the crushing weight of a false accusation. Yet the old life held no appeal. The choices, the bad luck, the path that had led him to that cell, he had no desire to retrace it. Instead, he chose a quieter path, one that led him back to the humble parish where he had stood as my acolyte, shrouded in miraculous grace. He lives here now, a quiet man who moves with a profound reverence, his eyes holding a depth that speaks of unspeakable sorrows and unspeakable wonders. He assists with the daily masses, tends the parish gardens, and his hands, once accustomed to the grim reality of prison labor, now carefully arrange flowers on the altar. He rarely speaks of what transpired, though occasionally in the quiet twilight of the church, I see him gaze at the statue of Our Lady, a soft, ineffable smile gracing his lips. He is a living chapel, a humble monument to faith found in the darkest hour, a testament to a prayer answered beyond all human comprehension. And so, I often reflect on the nature of God's mercy. It does not always manifest in ways we expect or can easily explain. We seek grand gestures, booming pronouncements, legal victories, but sometimes the greatest miracles unfold in the silence of a desperate heart. Marcus had called upon the mother not for escape from earthly justice, but for the truth to be revealed, for his family to know he was no monster. And in that ultimate act of surrender, when a forgotten soul called out to the Holy Mother, the walls of a prison cell became as thin as gossamer, and the truth was written not in ink, but in light. It was a truth that saved a life, healed a community, and reminded us all that even in the face of absolute darkness, God's light can pierce through, transforming despair into a glimmering hope and the impossible into an awe-inspiring reality. This, my friends, is the enduring legacy of faith, a whisper of the divine that echoes through time, reminding us that with God, all things truly are possible.